As we talked about last night, tens of millions of potential voters do not go to the polls in this country, but millions more do. So how do those who do vote behave? What prompts many of those votes most often for Republicans and many others to support the Democratic Party? Answer these questions are not as hard to find as you might think. Voting has been studied more closely than any other form of political participation in the United States. This is due partly to the importance of the topic and partly to the almost unlimited amount of data available. There have been innumerable elections in which millions of voters have cast ballots of votes over time. That research has produced large amounts of information about why people tend to vote as they do. So we're going to talk about two factors that influence voters, two basic means of studying voter behavior, which will be sociological factors and psychological factors. Observers still have to learn about voter behavior, but many sociological and psychological factors clearly influence the way people vote. Sociology is the study of groups and how people behave within society. The sociological factors affecting voter behavior are really the many pieces of a voter's social and economic life. These pieces are of two broad kinds: a voter's personal characteristics, age, race, income, occupation, education, religion, and so on. And two, a voter's group affiliation, so your family, your coworkers, friends, and the like. Psychology is the study of the mind and of individual behavior. The psychological factors that influence voter behavior are a voter's perceptions of politics, that is, how the voter sees the parties, the candidates, and the issues in an election. The difference between these two kinds of influencers are not so great as they might seem. In fact, they're closely related and constantly interact with one another. How voters look at parties, candidates, or issues is often shaped by their own social and economic backgrounds. Voters in lower income brackets are more likely to be Democrats, while voters in higher income brackets tend to be Republicans. This pattern is held up over time no matter whether a particular election was a cliffhanger or a blowout. More often, how one earns and what one does for a living are closely related. Professional and business people and others with higher incomes tend to vote for Republican candidates. Manual workers and others in lower income groups usually vote for Democrats. Thus, with the single exception of the 1964 election, professional and business people have voted heavily Republican in every presidential election in the modern era, including the 2004, 2008, and 2012 elections. Education is another sociological factor. Studies on behavior show that there is also a close relationship between the level of a voter's education and how he or she votes. College graduates vote for Republicans in higher percentages than do high school graduates, and high school graduates vote Republican more often than do those who have only gone through grade school. So you can see the higher the education, the more often or the more likely you tend to be Republican. There are often measurable differences between the partisan choices of men and women today. This phenomenon is known as the gender gap, and it first appears in the 1980s. A gender gap is a measurable difference between the partisan choices of men and women. Women generally tend to favor the Democrats by a margin of 5 to 10%, and men give the Grand Old Party a similar edge. The gender gap was less apparent in the 2004, 2008, and 2012 presidential elections. With that, President Bush won 48% of all the votes cast by women in that election. Studies also show that men and women are more likely to vote differently on issues such as abortion, healthcare, social welfare, and military involvement. Traditionally, younger voters have been more likely to be Democratic rather than Republican. Older voters are likely to find the Grand Old Party and its candidates more attractive. Thus, in every presidential election from 1960 through 1980, the Democrats won a larger percentage of the votes of the under 30 age group than of the 50 and over age bracket. That long-standing pattern was actually broken by Ronald Reagan's appeal to younger voters in 1984 and by George Bush in 1988. Although Bill Clinton restored the Democrats' claim to those voters in 1992 and 1996. So, as you can see, different generations will have different political values, and it may flip-flop depending on how you appeal to your voting public. Historically, a majority of Protestants have most often preferred the Grand Old Party. Catholics and Jews have been much more likely to be Democratic. For decades now, African Americans have supported the Democratic Party consistently and massively. They form the only group that have given the Democratic candidates a clear majority in every presidential election since 1952. There are now more than 39 million African Americans, and they make up the second largest minority in the country. In the North, African Americans generally voted Republican until the 1930s, but moved away from the party of Abraham Lincoln with the coming of the New Deal. The Civil Rights Movement led to a greater African American participation in the South, and today African Americans vote overwhelmingly Democratic in that region as well. The United States is now home to more than 42 million Latinos, people with Spanish-speaking backgrounds. Until now, Latinos have tended to favor Democratic candidates. However, the label Latino conceals differences among Cuban Americans, who most often vote Republican, Mexican Americans, and Puerto Ricans, who are strongly Democratic. The rate of turnout among Latinos is comparably less than 40%, especially in 1942, or in 2004. So you can see that different ethnic variables will conflict with religious values a lot of the time as well. Geographically, or the part of the country or the locale in which you live will have an impact of your voting behavior. After the Civil War, the states of the old Confederacy voted consistently Democratic, and that the southeast quarter of the nation became known as the Solid South. For more than a century, most Southerners, regardless of any other factor, identified with the Democratic Party. The Solid South is now a thing of the past. Republican candidates have been increasingly successful throughout the region over the past 40 years or so. This has been true in presidential elections and at the Senate and the local levels as well, state and local levels as well. Historically, the states that have supported the Republicans most consistently are Maine and Vermont in the Northeast, and Kansas, Nebraska, and Dakotas in the Midwest. These will be the red states. So you can see where it used to be a solid Democratic South, that southeast corner of the United States is now all red, meaning it is supporting the Republican Party. Voter attitudes vary in terms of the size of the communities in which they live. Democratic voters will draw their strength from the big cities of the North and the East. Many white Democrats have moved from the central cities and taken their political preferences with them. But Republican voters still dominate much of the suburban America. Voters in smaller cities and rural areas are also likely to vote Republican. Okay, so now we're going to look at some psychological factors. Although sociological factors are important, don't give too much weight to the voting mix of sociological factors. Those factors tend to be very static or unmoving, and they only change gradually and over time. So to understand voter behavior, you must look beyond factors as occupation, education, ethnic background, and place of residence. You also have to take into account a number of psychological factors. So you must look at voters' perceptions of politics, how they see and react to the parties, the candidates, and the issues in an election. A majority of Americans identify themselves with one or the other of major parties early in life, and most don't change. They support that party election after election with little or no regard for either the candidates or the issue. This is called party identification, so your loyalty towards a particular political party. It's the single most significant and lasting predictor of how a person will vote. A person who is Democrat or Republican will, for that reason, very likely vote for all or most of that party's candidates in any given election. The practice of voting for these candidates of only one party in election is called straight ticket voting. So if you're voting for everybody, you're called a straight ticket voter. Party identification is a key factor in American politics, although it's actually lost some of its impact in recent years. One of those signs is weakened condition of the parties themselves, and another marked increase is the split ticket voting, the practice of voting for the candidates of more than one party in an election. That behavior began to increase in the 1960s and actually fairly common today. Another sign is the large number of voters who now call themselves independents. This term is regularly used to identify those people who have no party affiliation. It includes voters who are independent of both the Republicans and the Democrats, and minor parties as well. Independent is a tricky term, however, many who claim to be independent actually support one or the other of the major parties quite regularly. So to end out our voting chapter, I recommend classifying yourself as a voter. Just remember, the United States is a democracy and it's your choice to vote. If you don't vote, one of the choices that is on the ballot will be made for you. Okay, head back to ClassJump.com, pick one sociological factor and explain it. Check out the political cartoon at the bottom. Don't vote, don't complain. That voter says, I'm John Q. Voter and I approve this message.